Thank you, Marilla, and I'm sorry to have done that to you. I really should have sent it to you at least a couple of weeks ago. How appropriate to be launching my book here in St. Pat's Hall, launching a book called Saving St. Bridget's. It's said that St. Pat warded off the snakes from Ireland, and St. Bridget's eternal flame burns in Ireland to ward off the evil spirits, so I reckon that Paddy and Bridget are up there looking after me if I break the leg tonight. On that note, I'd like to also acknowledge my Celtic ancestral spirits, acknowledge the Indigenous spirits of this land, and pay my respects to the elders past and present. Saving St. Bridget's is very much a local story, and by local I mean here, 15 minutes down the road, but this is a story that carries a very big, deep, universal truth. And that universal truth is that people need a place to belong. People need a place to share story and song, and that's no doubt part of the reason why you're here, whether you even realise it or not. But though we live in a world where we're always connected, we're always online, we all have plenty of friends, we also live in a world that's plagued by social isolation and disconnection and the fragmentation of community. This is the story of how our community here, 15 minutes down the road, faced those challenges and overcame them. It's also my story, and I couldn't possibly tell this story without telling my own personal story. I grew up 15 minutes down the road in the shadows of Tower Hill, the old volcano that you would have driven past on the way here to Port Fairy. Historians say that this stretch of land from Port Fairy all the way to Warrnambool had the highest population of Irish migration at the turn of the 20th century. So needless to say, I grew up as one of 10 children on a spud farm. You don't get much more Irish Catholic than that. Up on the other side of Tower Hill sits a church, a big old red Romanesque church, and a hall. They were built by our ancestors. In fact, it was my great-grandfather, Dan Lane, who led the charge to build the church. He went to the Bishop of Ballarat in 1913, and he said, "We want to build a church. We want to build a big one that we can proudly hand down to our children as a legacy." Those buildings weren't just at the centre of my childhood. They influenced my politics and my career too. I spent the first 5 or 6, 7 years of my career working within the Catholic Church, working for social justice, fighting for the rights for refugees, Indigenous Australia, global poverty. I was pretty engrossed in my day job when I got the call in late 2005 to come home for the last Mass of St. Bridget's. The decision to close the church had been made quite quickly, with very little community consultation. And the reasons for that were pretty much boiled down to 2 things. That was that they were old and empty, and that they cost a lot to maintain. There were some of us in our community who saw a different reality and had a different vision. Shane Howard was one of those, and my father was another. So on that very hot day in January 2006, I walked into that big old Romanesque church, and I felt an overwhelming sense of place, an overwhelming sense of belonging, a sense of knowing what it means to belong somewhere in the world. But I also felt an overwhelming sense of anger. My father had written a letter to the church hierarchy, a long and detailed one which stated our case for why we believed these very precious buildings should stay in our community. But that letter had been ignored. So I sat there, listening to the priest say his homily, with my head bowed and my blood boiling, and I had this moment, don't know if anyone's ever felt the same, where you just want to get up and state your case, where I just thought I could do this, I really could tell the truth as it deserves to be told, and ask that the people, 600 people beside me, do the same. Of course I didn't. I was I'm a good Catholic, and I was sitting inside a church, and there's no place for that in Sunday Mass. But I did go and speak to the priest after the Mass, and I expressed to him my confusion and my hurt, and told him what I did for a day job. I asked him, how is it that we could stand on the side of the poor and the marginalised, and yet when it came to the rights of the parishioners sitting here in the pews, those principles could be thrown out the window. His next 10 words redefined my understanding of the Catholic Church from that day forward, and in the process, you might say, redefined the course of my life. He stood back up on a step behind him, and he held his hand up and he said to me, "Regina, the church is not a democracy, I am the power here." It wasn't exactly the consolation I was looking for. 3 days later, I was the guest speaker at a National Catholic Youth Social Justice Festival in Ballarat. There were 300 young people from around Australia, school teachers, priests, nuns, and 5 bishops, including the Bishop of Ballarat. I was given 40 minutes to tell my story of why I work in social justice. I was meant to express my thoughts and my feelings and my experiences, and I was sitting in that little old blue boarding school the night before my speech, and I was having a crisis of conscience. And so I rang my dad. And I said, "Dad, I've got to do this speech and I just don't know what to do. I can't say what I'm really thinking." And Dad said, "But, you have to. This is your story." And I'm like, "Dad, there's like 5 bishops here. I can't." He's like, "But Regina, they've asked to hear your story. St. Bridget's is part of your story." I'm like, "Dad, I could lose my job." And my dad said to me, "Regina, this is your job, isn't it?" It was one of those moments in life when you just know what it is you have to do. It was like my dad was speaking to my deepest truth, and I just knew I just had to get up and tell the truth, tell the story that needed to be told. And so I did. I asked that audience a fundamental question. I asked, how is it that the Catholic Church can stand so passionately and rightfully so on behalf of the poor and the marginalised, and yet when it comes to the rights of the people in the pews, those same principles can be thrown out the window? The young people loved it. There was standing ovation and screaming and cheering and all sorts of chaos, but the bishops, not so much. It was, however, Teresa O'Brien who led the charge to save St. Bridget's. The week after that, in January 2006, she called a community meeting in Corrie, and on that day, the Friends of St. Bridget's were formed. Little did we know on that day that we were about to embark on a 6, 7, 8 year, forgotten, year campaign that would take many years off our lives and take our battle all the way to Rome. You might be wondering why this battle took so long. Obviously, I can't go into the detail here, but in a nutshell, part of what left us in limbo was that on the one hand, we had a bishop who had told us repeatedly, "You have my word, St. Bridget's will not be sold, St. Bridget's will not be sold, St. Bridget's will not be sold." He said that 3 times to us. And on the other hand, we had a priest who was so convinced that the decision to close St. Bridget's was his, that he sought a ruling from Rome. And he had the Vatican affirm for him that yes, the decision to close St. Bridget's was his and his alone. So all this time, our beautiful old church and our beautiful old hall that had been so much used and so much loved by our community for so many years, sat idle with the doors locked and we, the community, locked out. I don't know if any of you were here. We're at that first session back in 2006, where we had to migrate to the Killarney Recreation Reserve down the road for our first session, which we were very lucky to have Mary Black as the headline act here at Port Fairy, and she joined us that evening in a room half this size, half this well catered for, and half the feeling of our beautiful old hall. But we had a magnificent night that night, and we have continued to do so every Monday night since after the Folk Festival, and you're all obviously welcome on Monday night to our next session, where I'm obviously launching the book again. Our objectives in saving St Bridget's were pretty simple. We were proud of what our ancestors had achieved 100 years ago, and we wanted to uphold that for future generations. St Bridget's went on the market in June 2009. We were informed of that when we got a courtesy phone call from LJ Hooker. That was when our campaign really swung into full gear, and we were very lucky, we are very lucky, I'm sure you'll agree, in this corner of southwest Victoria, to have such incredible musical talent, which I'm sure you're all enjoying this weekend. We have Archie Roach and Hattie's dear late wife Ruby headline a concert for us at St Bridget's when we got access to the buildings, so that we could possibly say farewell to these buildings that had been at the centre of our community. It was an amazing night. It was absolutely sellout crowd. In fact, we had to open up the church and kind of do a secondary concert there to kind of accommodate everybody. And to have a lineup of Indigenous artists on stage appealing to us as predominantly white, middle-aged, middle-class, Anglo-Saxon people, of what it was that we risked losing as a community was pretty powerful and pretty ironic. Archie said two things that night that have always stuck with me. He said, when Shane told me what had happened here, he said, I was offended. When you take something from a people, they are diminished. They become lesser for it. And he also said, once they keep chipping away at that old community spirit, it's just going to up and leave us. But what do we mean when we talk about community spirit? Or we talk about spirit of place, as in Shane Howard's fame? It's not an easy thing to define, but it certainly wasn't about the bricks and the mortar. It certainly wasn't about a prime piece of real estate on 5 acres overlooking the Southern Ocean. It was about something far deeper and something far more universal, but also something that was very, very simple. I'm going to now share with you a reading from my book, which is my best attempt at summing that up. For some of us, it was holding on to our cultural heritage. For others, it was about handing something on to our children. But mostly, people came because they simply wanted to protect the little things that communities are made of. A wave as you pass by, a hot casserole when you've just had a baby, someone around to feed the chooks while you're away. Life in Killarney and Crossley was a reminder of how life used to be. Before our pace of life became so frantic, we began to outsource these things, and our culture became so individualistic that we forgot that we used to ask our neighbour for a cup of sugar when we needed it. It is through these most insignificant of daily interactions, across the fence or down at the corner store, that the strength of a community rests. It's knowing your neighbour's dog's name and taking it home when it's lost its way. It's when kids feel safe to knock on doors to sell raffle tickets. It's hitching a ride with the neighbours when you've missed the bus, or handing out sandwiches after a funeral. These were the routines and the rituals of my childhood that gave me my sense of place in the world. When I'm asked, where do you come from? It evokes a memory for me of more than the potato fields and the ocean, the volcano and the Celtic crosses. It evokes images of people who know each other and had time to stop and talk. People who are settled and happy with who and where they are. When I lived overseas, asked the same question, I always answered Melbourne for ease of reference. Then, my mind is filled with far different characteristics: speed, restlessness, and a sense of anonymity. Saving St Bridget's for me, and others like me, was more than just fighting for a building. It was fighting for the survival of something hard to put our finger on, but something we could feel slipping away in our world. Communities aren't just given, they have to be created. Our great-grandparents understood this. We would be fooling ourselves if we thought we could survive otherwise. I wrote this book as an expression of my deepest truth, for better or worse, in the vain hope that I might speak to a slice of your deepest truth. That in this book you might find some values that you too also hold dear, and that together we might uphold them and keep our community strong. Thank you.
Come on, how many of you are from this community? Give her a stand up, stand up. Please tell your story for you. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Do you feel like singing?
Yes.
Good, because I was told that I was supposed to come in and get you guys to do some singing. So I have a spot here that I get to do some singing. And those of you who come to the Crossley sessions on Monday night, I'll see you there. And if you're not in the hall, we'll be over in the church.